Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. We had a listener write in and ask us to do a deep dive on something that's, well, frankly, it's kind of shrouded in mystery and it's a sensitive subject. The deaths of young porn stars. I mean, we hear about these cases every so often, and it's always tragic, right? So we've been gathering information from like news articles, social media posts, and even got some expert commentary to really try and understand what's going on.
That's definitely a topic that deserves, a deeper look.
Yeah.
And, I think it's important to say right off the bat, we're not here to judge the adult film industry or the people in it, right? But the fact is, the number of performers dying so young, that's something that should concern us all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it's not just like a handful of cases here and there. It seems like it's a real trend, a disturbing one when you look at the info you sent over.
Well, yeah. One thing that really stood out from the research is the average age of death for porn stars is only 37.
37, wow. I mean, that's younger than the average life expectancy in most developed countries.
Exactly. And to really illustrate this, let's consider Olivia Nova, who passed away when she was just 20 years old.
Oh, yeah, her case was really sad. Didn't she die from sepsis caused by UTI?
That's right. And what's particularly heartbreaking is that she had been involved in the industry from a young age, starting as a child model before transitioning to adult films. That's something that was mentioned in a few of the sources.
It's such a stark contrast.
Mhm.
Starting so young and then having her life cut short like that. And I think some of the articles mentioned that she was struggling with alcohol, after her boyfriend passed away.
Right. And that really highlights a crucial point. I mean, when we talk about the deaths in the industry, we need to understand the different causes. And of course, we have to be careful to present information objectively. But drug overdoses, well, that's something that comes up again and again in these cases.
Yeah, you see that with Sophia Leone and Yuri Luev. I mean, they were both so young. And sadly, both of their deaths were linked to drug use.
Exactly. And while each case is unique, some experts suggest that drug use in the industry is often a way for performers to try and cope with the intense pressure and the emotional toll of the work.
It's like they're self-medicating to deal with a really, really tough environment.
That's a possibility. That's definitely worth exploring further. And then we have the issue of suicide. It's tragically prevalent in the industry, and it's a very sensitive topic. August Ames's case is a really powerful example.
Yeah, August Ames. She was only 23 when she took her own life. I remember there were a lot of discussions about the role of online bullying and harassment in her case. The internet can be so cruel.
Absolutely. And her case raises some serious questions about the potential link between cyberbullying and mental health struggles, particularly in an industry that faces so much scrutiny online.
It's tough to imagine the pressure of being constantly judged and criticized like that. I mean, it would take a toll on anyone's well-being. And then there are those cases where, well, the circumstances surrounding the death aren't really clear.
Right. You're talking about cases like Sophia Leone's. There was so much conflicting information initially. In fact, her modeling agency even said that the police were investigating it as a robbery and homicide. But later, it was officially ruled an accidental overdose.
Yeah, but even the fact that there was suspicion of foul play, even though it was later disproven, it really shows you how dangerous this industry can be.
Absolutely. And there are also cases like Taylor Summers, a 23-year-old model who was actually murdered. The perpetrator was a photographer who had worked with her, which highlights the risks, especially for those working independently, without the structure of a studio or agency.
It's so sad. And it makes you think, like all these cases, even though the details are different, they all point to some pretty dark things going on within the industry. What are some of the things we really need to understand here?
Well, one thing that keeps coming up in the sources is exploitation and abuse. It seems to be a real problem for a lot of performers. Some experts believe that some directors actually intentionally break contracts as a way to exert power and control.
Wait, really? So you're saying it's a tactic, like they're doing it on purpose to manipulate the performers?
That seems to be the case sometimes, and this is especially concerning because a lot of performers come into the industry with, pre-existing vulnerabilities, which can make them even more susceptible to that kind of treatment.
So we've got potential drug use, mental health struggles, and now the possibility of exploitation. And you mentioned that the internet has added another layer of complexity to all of this.
Yeah, for sure. The rise of tube sites and platforms like OnlyFans, they've made the industry more accessible, right? But they've also made it way more competitive and, let's be honest, pretty cutthroat for the people trying to make a living in it.
So you're saying it's harder to make a decent living,
Huh.
and there's more pressure to do more extreme things to stand out.
Right. And think about this. The internet never forgets. Anything that gets put online, it stays there forever. That kind of content can haunt performers long after they've left the industry.
Yeah, it's tough to imagine trying to build a new life with that kind of stuff hanging over you.
It's a real concern. And then on top of all that, there's the lack of support that so many performers face, both within and outside of the industry.
Yeah, it's like they're caught in a system that's not doing enough to protect them. It seems like there's a whole web of problems that are contributing to these deaths.
It's definitely not a simple issue with easy answers. Drug abuse, mental health struggles, exploitation, the stigma around the industry, lack of support. It all creates a pretty bleak picture.
And it's easy to think, oh, this is just something that happens in that world that doesn't really affect me.
But I think what's fascinating, and maybe even disturbing, is that these tragedies actually reflect bigger problems in our society that we all need to think about.
Okay, let's unpack that. What are some of those broader issues you're seeing reflected in these deaths?
Well, when you really think about it, the pressures to conform, the way we objectify bodies, how we treat people in the sex industry, I mean, those things reflect our values as a society, right?
Yeah. So what you're saying is these deaths, they're like a symptom of a bigger problem. Like we're all kind of contributing to this in a way.
It's something to think about for sure. If we want to prevent these tragedies from happening, I think we need to be honest with ourselves about how we view sex and sexuality. It's about recognizing that these are human beings, with their own stories and struggles. They deserve compassion, not judgment.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's easy to forget that, to just see the images and not the real people behind them.
Ugh.
So what does this all mean for us, the viewers, the people consuming this content? What's our role in all this?
That's a tough question, and I think everyone has to answer it for themselves. It's not about guilt-tripping anyone, but it is about awareness. When we're watching this stuff, we need to remember there's a real person on the other side of that screen, a person with their own life and their own problems.
So it's about being more thoughtful about what we're watching and who's making it.
Exactly. But what about the industry itself? Don't they have a responsibility to protect the people who work for them?
Yeah, that's a good point.
There are some signs that things might be changing, at least in some places. Some studios are starting to implement stricter rules and offer more support to their performers.
Like what kind of support?
Well, things like mental health services, financial advice, even help with, transitioning out of the industry. They're starting to realize that this work can have a lasting impact, and people need help beyond just the time they spend on set.
Those sound like positive steps, for sure.
Yeah.
But is it enough? Is it happening on a big enough scale to actually make a difference?
It's definitely a start. But there's still a lot of work to be done. The industry needs to do more to tackle those big systemic problems we talked about. The exploitation, the lack of support, the whole culture of silence around abuse.
Yeah, it feels like they need a total overhaul, not just a few tweaks here and there. We've talked a lot about the tragedy of it all, but I'm also curious about the performers themselves. What are their experiences like?
That's important to remember. Every performer has their own story, their own reasons for getting into this line of work. Some might be chasing fame and money. Others might be drawn to the idea of sexual liberation or empowerment.
But it sounds like for a lot of them, the reality doesn't really match up with the fantasy.
That's often the case, unfortunately. The industry is incredibly demanding, both physically and emotionally. Constantly having to perform, pushing boundaries to stay relevant. That takes a toll.
That's something we keep seeing in all these sources, this intense pressure to stay relevant, to keep getting views and making money.
Exactly. And with those online platforms like OnlyFans, I mean, the pressure is even higher. It's like they're all running their own businesses now, competing for attention in this massive marketplace.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Wild West out there, right? You're on your own. And we've heard stories about the emotional toll, too. It sounds really isolating.
It can be. A lot of performers talk about feeling disconnected from the real world, like they're living in a bubble. It's hard to form genuine relationships when you're worried about the stigma attached to your work, the fear of judgment or rejection.
It's almost like they're trapped, even if they want to leave. And leaving the industry, that's a whole other challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that so hard for so many performers?
Well, there's the financial part of it. I mean, finding a job that pays as well, especially if you don't have a lot of experience outside of that world, it's really tough. And then there's the stigma, like we've been talking about.
Yeah, that stigma can be hard to escape. It can affect your relationships, how you feel about yourself, even your whole sense of who you are. It's a label that sticks with you, even if you've moved on to a completely different part of your life.
Exactly. And then, there's the issue of abuse, which is really hard to talk about, but we can't ignore it. Over the years, there have been so many allegations of physical and emotional abuse, from directors pressuring people to do things they're uncomfortable with, to, even instances of non-consensual acts.
It's just awful to think that this kind of exploitation is happening
Hmm.
and that it's often covered up, hidden by a culture of secrecy.
Sadly, that's a pattern we see over and over in the research. The industry has a history of protecting the abusers and silencing the victims, which makes it so hard for people to speak out or get justice.
There was that case, I can't remember her name, but she was raped by her partner, and the video was actually posted online. She ended up killing him in self-defense, but then she went to prison, separated from her children. It's just heartbreaking.
That case is a really disturbing example of how the industry fails to protect its people and how, sometimes the legal system can actually make things worse for victims. It also raises questions about the role of those online platforms, the ones hosting this content. Do they have a responsibility to ensure the safety of the people in the videos?
It's complicated, right? There are so many layers of responsibility here. And, speaking of online platforms, we have to acknowledge the role of technology in all this. I mean, the internet has made it so much easier to access this kind of content, but it's also created new ways for people to be exploited and abused.
Oh, absolutely. And now you've got deepfakes and AI-generated content, and it's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's fake. That raises a whole bunch of ethical questions about consent, authenticity, and, the potential for people to be manipulated and hurt.
It's kind of scary, right?
Yeah,
Like we're heading into this digital world where anything is possible, and the consequences could be really bad.
it's a valid concern, and it shows why we need to have serious conversations about how to regulate all this new technology. We have to think about the potential for harm, but we also have to recognize the power of technology to connect people and spread information. It's a tough balance to strike.
Okay, this has been a really heavy conversation. It's easy to get bogged down in all the negativity, but I want to go back to something you said earlier, that these tragedies are a reflection of bigger issues in society.
Yeah, that's a really important point to remember. It's easy to dismiss the deaths of porn stars as something that happens in a world that's separate from ours, but the truth is, these issues are connected to our values and beliefs as a society.
So how do these tragedies, reflect back on us? What are we seeing in these stories that tells us something about our society?
Think about how we talk about sex in our culture. There's still so much shame around it, so much stigma.
Yeah.
We objectify people's bodies, especially women's bodies, and we often don't see sex workers as real people, as people who deserve respect.
So you're saying those attitudes contribute to the problems in the porn industry? Like it's not just an isolated thing, it's connected to how we see sex and sexuality in general.
Exactly. The industry is a product of our culture, and it also reinforces those same cultural norms. If we want to see real change, we have to challenge those harmful attitudes and start talking about sex in a more open and honest way.
That sounds like a huge task. I mean, where do we even begin to change something like that?
It starts with awareness, just like we've been talking about. Educate yourself about the issues, look at your own biases, and be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations.
So we need to admit that we all have biases, right? That we have these preconceived ideas about the industry and the people in it.
For sure. And there are organizations out there doing great work to support sex workers. You can donate to them, volunteer, or just spread the word about what they do.
Yeah, and it's so important to remember that these are real people with families and friends and dreams, just like everyone else.
Absolutely. We can't forget their humanity.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I can't help but feel a sense of responsibility. Like we can't just watch this content without thinking about the real people involved and what our role is in all of this.
I think that's a really good takeaway. It's about being a conscious consumer, but it's also about questioning our assumptions and thinking critically about this whole issue.
What kind of assumptions do you mean?
Well, like the assumption that all porn stars are rich and happy and living the dream. We've seen that that's not true for a lot of them. Many of them struggle with exploitation, abuse, and mental health problems just like anyone else.
Yeah, we kind of buy into this idea of empowerment and sexual freedom without seeing the downsides, without recognizing the problems within the industry.
Right. It's important to remember that there are many different perspectives on this issue, and the reality is always more complicated than it seems.
That statistic, the one about the average age of death being only 37, it really makes you think. It's a reminder of the real human cost of this industry and all the things that contribute to these tragedies.
It is a sobering thought, and it should encourage us to challenge our assumptions and really dig into the complexities of the issue.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to make things better? It feels overwhelming to think about changing something so ingrained in our society?
It is a complex issue, but ultimately, change starts with each of us. We can all do our part to raise awareness, challenge harmful attitudes, and advocate for a more just and compassionate world.
That's a really powerful message. I think that's a good place to end our deep dive. You've given us all a lot to think about, and I hope our listeners will do their own research and keep learning about this important topic. Thanks for joining us.